Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this event on why class still matters as part of this year's Media Democracy Festival, organized by Media Reform Coalition. The Media Reform Coalition works to bring together civil society groups, researchers, and media practitioners to develop policies and campaign for media reform in the light of communications environment that continues to be dominated by a handful of large, powerful organizations and is characterized by insufficient polarity, diversity, and accountability. I am Golam Kiavani, and I teach in the Department of Media, Communication, and Cultural Studies at Goldsmith, University of London. I am chairing today's discussion. I'm joined by a fantastic panel of speakers, each of whom will speak for around 10 minutes in the order that I'm introducing them, and then we'll come together at the end for a discussion. If you would like to ask a question, please add it to the comment stream on the platform you are watching on, and we will take as many questions as possible in the time we have. So, speakers. Deirdre O'Neill is a working class academic and filmmaker. She is the author of Film as a Radical Pedagogic Tool, the principal editor of the Journal of Class and Culture, and the coordinator of the Inside Film Project. Her most recent film, co-directed with Michael Wayne, is The Acting Class, about the lack of working class actors. Sarah O'Connell is a freelance investigative journalist and filmmaker who works for all major news channels, including BBC News and ITV News. Mostly her films looked at the criminal justice system, but she has covered a wide range of topics such as housing, bereavement, and mental health. And finally, Sarah Jaffe is the author of Why Work Won't Love You Back, How Devotions to Our Jobs Keep Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone, and Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt. Both books have been published by Bulltype Books. She is a published author and an independent journalist covering politics of power from workplace to the street. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and Washington Post, New Republic, and many other publications. We'll start our discussions with Deirdre O'Neill. Deirdre, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Right, hi everyone. So I'm just going to start straight away with the subject of class and the media. So what I wanted to say to start with was that I think it's really important when we talk about the media that we're very careful that we're not treating it as something separate from society as a whole, kind of, thinking about society and the media as something separate. The media, I mean, this is obvious, but the media is part of the society in which we all live. And therefore, I would say it's no surprise that classism is embedded within it at every level and at all areas. So we can begin by talking about representation of working class people within the media and how that representation is obviously often very negative. Current representations of working class people and working class life in the dominant media has been reduced to visual cliches and stereotypes, mostly in reality TV shows. This has become particularly pronounced, I would argue, since the Brexit vote, when the working class who voted to leave the European Union have been constructed as xenophobic, racist, uneducated or undereducated, stupid, knuckle draggers. I mean, it just goes on and on. And often this is in the kind of dominant or mainstream media. So within this framework, working class lives are represented as kind of culturally regressive. And they're presented within a decontextualized landscape where lives defined by exploitation, oppression, and numerous hardships are unlinked from the political decisions that are responsible for those hardships and that oppression. While at the same time, and I think this is my most important point, I think, the people who speak about them in the media, the people who speak about the working class in the media have no experience of working class life. And this is one of the major problems, or as I say, what I think probably the biggest problem with the media now. It's not just about the concentration of media ownership, and of course that's really important, but it's also about the class position of the people who work in the media, not just because of the way in which the working class are represented in these kind of very negative representations, but because it doesn't provide a true picture of working class life and the ideological role that these negative representations play in constructing a series of degraded images of working class people that are then utilised in the media to justify and legitimise the rolling back of the welfare state. The appropriation of working class struggle has become a career choice which the middle class columnist and journalist uses as a hook to hang their career trajectories on. The most noticeable thing about these representations is the way in which working class are constructed as a problem to be solved, rather than a group of people with their own ideas, their own culture, and their own way of life, even though that way of life has been systematically and strategically destroyed over the last 40 years. So one of the reasons it's been possible to represent the working class in such negative ways is the fact that the media, and here I'm talking about journalists, I'm talking about filmmakers, actors, radio presenters, the media as a whole, the people within the media are drawn from the professional middle class, a class that has very little respect for or interest in the working class. Having said that, I mean, that might not be completely true, because there was some research published last month by Friedman and O'Brien that suggested that middle class people go to extraordinary lengths to claim a working classness that they actually don't have. And it's interesting to think that there was a time when the middle classes tried their utmost to distance themselves from the working class, to not be associated with them, and kind of use their cultural capital in order to do this. Whereas what we have now is a situation where their cultural capital depends on them being able to ignore their privileges or paper over their privileges and economic advantage in order to claim the cultural capital of being working class. Of course, they don't want the economic deprivation of being working class. What this doesn't change is the fact that no matter how many middle class people identify as working class, the majority of those working in the media industries come from the middle class. And I would argue that the Corbyn project, one of the interesting things about the Corbyn project was it was built on a very kind of fragile and tenuous coming together of the young middle class, university educated professional, the kind of momentum members, if you like, and Guardian readers, and the older, more traditional working class. So the inability of the middle class members of the Labour Party to consider the working class as equals, their eagerness to overturn a democratic vote because it did not suit their needs, has, I think, broken this link irretrievably. The domination of the public sphere, both institutionally and culturally, by an economically and educationally privileged middle class, has resulted in the censorship of working class voices, and a middle class with no experience of working class life ventriloquizing those voices. So just, one of the things I was asked to do in this talk was what do I think can be done about this? And I think there's I have one first step as a kind of suggestion, and that is I think we should all be fighting for social economic disadvantage to be one of the protected characteristics listed in the Equality Act. So for those of you, who aren't aware, I'm sure most of you are, there's 9 characteristics in the Equality Act. There's age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage, civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. These are all protected characteristics. And the interesting thing about these characteristics is that our experience of them is very much affected by the one category that has been left out, and that's our social economic position. And when we say social economic position, what we mean is class. And in a market-based society, that's a society that is structured around social economic equalities like our one. Class is something that we don't talk about. So the Equality Act in 2010 was a significant step forward in tackling social inequalities. And chief among its instruments was the social economic duty, which was in section 1. And that requires public authorities to have due regard to the desirability of exercising their functions in a way which reduces the inequalities of outcome that result from social economic disadvantages, that result from being born into the working class. But unfortunately, it's there. It's on the statute books, but successive governments have failed to bring Section 1 into effect. What it does and what it would do if it was brought into effect would offer a powerful lever for reducing the damaging gaps that contribute to excluding the working class from the public sphere. And I just want to be careful here that, because inclusion, I think, is a kind of strange word to use in terms of the working class, because if that inclusion is predicated on giving up your background, your accent, all the other kind of, things that make you working class, then it's not inclusion, it's assimilation. And that's not what I'm talking about. The working class needs to be able to represent themselves in their own way and not be limited by the rather narrow parameters of the dominant media. So to go back to the social economic duty, if it were illegal to discriminate against working class people on the grounds of their lack of economic privilege, there might be then fewer middle class people in decision-making positions talking on behalf of the working class and taking up all the space on the platform while pushing their own agendas which have very little to do with working class life. If it were illegal to discriminate against the working class, then working class communities might have some leverage in their fight against local council regeneration schemes, which in lucrative partnerships with property developers gentrify working class areas and social cleanse whole communities and cultures of people who've lived in those areas, sometimes for generations. People who attend fee-paying independent schools, which is only 7% of the people in this country, and then go on to Oxbridge, are incredibly overrepresented in all of the well-paid decision-making professions. So 75% of senior judges, 59% of the cabinet, 50% of diplomats, 47% of newspaper columnists, 33% of BBC executives, and only 10 to 15% of actors come from manual working class backgrounds. So I want to end where I began and suggest that we need to think about the media not in isolation, but it's just another element of the classism which is rife in this country.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. We're going to move on to the next speaker, Sarah O'Connell. Sarah, the microphone is yours, please.
Thank you. Okay, so I work for mainstream news media, and before you all boo and hiss, there's a lot of positive things about working for mainstream news media. What I'm going to try and focus on in this very short speech is elements of stories and angles of stories that, because of a lack of class representation and class diversity within the elements of mainstream media, they suffer enormously, and a lot of this could be rectified. Before I go into specifics, I'd like to make just two general points. Firstly, I've been a journalist for 25 years now, and in the last 2 or 3 years, I have seen a lot of improvement in the nation's newsrooms. This is the national newsrooms, Sky, BBC, ITV, Channel 4. I have genuinely seen a lot of improvement in the quote-unquote diversity and the representation amongst journalism in the newsroom, but it's always or almost always been racial. So what I think has really happened in the past couple of years is that mainstream news media has gone some way to acknowledging that they do not represent the general public in their journalists. But I think they're making a mistake by thinking that diversity is only about race. It's not only about race, it's about class. And I would argue that in some instances, mainstream news editors and bosses have thought, just by ticking a box about race, that they've done the jobs, basically. That's the end of that. Everything's diverse. But if they're employing people from non-white backgrounds who are basically quite privileged as well, and I do think that white news editors can suffer from the idea that if you're black, you're poor. And that's not always the case. You can still be a black journalist from an extraordinarily privileged background. And I know this happens because I know some of these people. So I think there's a big problem at the moment in mainstream news with accepting that they're not diverse, but thinking that diversity is simply about race. It's not about race. So I would really like to make that point, because I think we're missing what we should be doing. We've got our eyes in the wrong direction, or we're not focusing on everything that we should be doing. The second thing I would like to say is about fake news. I think the idea of fake news, I understand what people mean by fake news, but I think because of lack of class representation and fair representation in the mainstream news, people have jumped onto this idea of fake news. I work for mainstream, as I've said, and I've worked for all the major news organisations, and never in 25 years of journalism have I not had to live with my work, live up to the highest standards of factual accuracy. And it kind of grieves me, this idea of people saying it's fake, it's fake. It's not fake news. What I would argue is that our agendas are what are skewed. It's not our lack of factual accuracy, it's our agendas. We don't have the right agenda. So, for example, we could put a story on the news about someone on benefits, and this is more for the papers really than broadcast news, but you know, we've all seen those stories in the papers that say, woman who lives on benefits, 8 children, 10-bedroomed house. That might be true. It might be factually accurate. It's not literally fake news, but our agenda in doing that is what's biased, and that is what we have to change. So I don't think you can say we've got fake agendas, but I definitely think you can say we've had biased agendas. And that there's a difference though to me. So it does grieve me working for mainstream, knowing how hard I have to strive to make sure everything I do is factually accurate, to see it all dismissed as just fake news. Anyway, those are 2 general points that I'd like to make. Regards my own work and the work I do, mostly focusing on the criminal justice system, things like that, I mean, it just upsets me really how little coverage stories get that should get a lot of coverage. So, for example, the stabbings and deaths of so many young black men in London, which I think is, people think it's about racism. The reason we don't cover those stories, it's about racism. And I definitely think there's an element of racism in those decisions that they don't get a lot of pickup. But it's as much about classism as it is about racism, because we don't ask questions of these boys. We dismiss them. Oh, they're in a gang. Oh, they were trouble. And there's a kind of undercurrent there. Oh, they deserve to die. We don't say that, but sometimes it seems like we mean that. What we don't do is we don't explore their backgrounds. We don't ask questions about the kind of lives they might have had, the kind of problems they might have had. How did they end up carrying that knife? Why did they end up carrying that knife? And most of the young men I know who carry knives, and I know quite a few young men who carry knives, they come from very similar backgrounds. And it's not just a racial thing. They come from poor backgrounds. They come from disadvantaged homes. They don't have a lot of money in the family. They don't have a lot of job opportunities. That, you know, that they might feel quite angry about society and the way that it's treated them. This is a class thing as much as a racial thing. So that's one story which I think doesn't get enough traction, and it's about class as much as it's about race. The other story I think doesn't get a lot of traction because of classism is domestic violence and domestic abuse. And the way this plays out to me is that all of the refuges that I've gone into, women's refuges, are always full of working class women. Now, I'm not stupid, and I know that domestic abuse can cut across all class barriers. It's not just a working class thing, but women who end up in refuges are probably more likely to be working class. Because they're poorer and they can't afford to go to their friend's house who's got 3 spare rooms and all of this kind of thing. And it doesn't get picked up on by middle-class journalists who, they might know friends who've been abused, but they don't know people who are having those issues. And it's hugely, hugely problematic. And leading on from that, to me, the biggest story of the decade, possibly, is housing. Housing underpins so many news stories. We don't always see that, but housing is a huge issue. None of my colleagues that I can think of in mainstream journalism were brought up in social housing. I may be doing a few misjustice, I don't know, but most of them were from very privileged backgrounds, as we all acknowledge. So they don't see or understand the problems that people face when they're living in temporary accommodation, when they can't get decent tenancies. It's a massive, massive problem, which we really need to address. So moving on, because I want to talk really about solutions and ways that mainstream news media can resolve these problems, and practical solutions that I think that we can do in the mainstream that will resolve these problems. So firstly, I think we need to acknowledge that they're there. I don't see a lot of acknowledgement of class bias in the newsrooms. I see a lot of acknowledgement of racial bias and lack of representation. Don't see a lot of acknowledgement amongst my colleagues, really, and definitely not in the wider debate about the lack of class representation. It needs to be acknowledged by the bosses. Tim Davie at the BBC needs to come out and acknowledge that this is a problem. Now, 3 or 4 years ago, I filled in a form for the BBC, which was a freelance form, and it asked me if my parents had gone to university. So I do think, leading on to the second thing that I think we need to be doing, is monitoring the class background of journalists. Now, in this form, they're asking me, did your parents go to university? I can only imagine the reason that they're asking that is because they're actually trying, at least, to monitor the class background of people who work in the media. Now, I don't know what the BBC's done with that information, or I have no idea, but they were gathering it 3 years ago. But everyone needs to be gathering this information. We can't change what we don't understand and what we don't know is happening. So we need to acknowledge and we need to monitor. There needs to be an acceptance as well, I think, that there are other routes into mainstream media than just going to university and or then doing a postgraduate course in journalism. I meet a lot of people now that have done postgraduate courses in journalism before they entered mainstream news. I have no problem with that. Most of the people I meet who've come in that way are very skilled and talented at what they're doing. But there has to be another way of getting into the media. It can't just be going to university, because we're missing out on a huge pool of talent. That's what grieves me the most. The other thing I think that mainstream news media needs to be doing is going out and meeting people, networking, going into community centres, networking with young people and explaining to people what it is we do and how they can get into it. And I think if we do some of these things, then we might be in with a chance of actually getting a more representative workforce.
Thank you so much. I want to remind you, please, if you've got any questions, make sure you ask them via the platform in which you're watching this program. Last but not least, Sarah Jaffe. Sarah, the microphone is yours.
Hello. Thanks, everyone. You can hear me. Yes, I unmuted myself. That's always good to know. I'm so pleased to be here. As you can hear from my voice, I'm an American, so I listened for things that I might not know about the UK media already. And I think most of what I'm going to say is going to come from my experience in the US media, but I think it broadly applies to the UK as well. The thing I want to start out by telling is a little story, actually, that Sarah's last one of her comments about the knife question brought back to my mind, because in New York, where I currently live, there was a rash of arrests for something called a gravity knife recently, which is I don't know because I don't own one, but it's apparently a knife that sort of opens itself. It's not quite a switchblade, but something like it. And the people who were getting arrested for this used it for work, which was why they carried a knife. But of course, you know, the stories of gravity knife arrests were missed because it wasn't assumed that man of color being arrested with a knife would have it because he was going to his job. So I say all that because I'm a labor reporter. I write about work, and that means that when I think about class in the media, I think about what that says about the jobs in the media, and the state of jobs in the media is awful. Today, reporters at Fortune magazine are engaged in a virtual walkout because after a year and a half of bargaining with management, they say management has refused to respond to nearly 20 of our proposals on issues like diversity, severance provisions, and health and safety, intentionally choosing to hold up progress on our collective bargaining agreement instead. Last week, of course, we found that HuffPost's new owner, Jonah Peretti, fired 47 US employees, shut down HuffPost Canada, and is shutting down most of HuffPost UK. According to a report in The Guardian, 16 out of 29 full-time journalists at its London office received emails this week informing them that they also face losing their jobs. Not the actual information that they're losing their jobs, just that they might lose their jobs. Only the site's separate politics team will be retained, and the editor-in-chief is one of those among who may lose her job. Every mother on the UK editorial staff has been told they face losing their job, including one person on maternity leave. 4 jobs are available out of the 16, and 11 of them are women. That's just the past week. Broadly in the media over the last several years, decades in the US, we've seen the death of local news. And I'm mostly talking about print reporting here because local television news continues to exist. It's just horrible. So what does that mean when I say that local news is dead? It means that there are a lot of places in the US that don't have a local newspaper. What does that mean for the subject of class? Well, it has meant a more consolidated, smaller, and more elite media, which is more concentrated in New York City, Washington, D.C., and the other most expensive cities in the world. It means that many communities have no one who covers them full time and no one who comes from them in the media. And that, of course, affects how working class communities are covered. Because it's harder for people who didn't go to Yale or Columbia, the US equivalents of Oxbridge, to succeed in the media. That does, as the previous 2 speakers have said, create a disconnect in what gets covered. That's meant really awful coverage on a variety of issues, which you all are probably familiar with the notorious and terrible and wrong way that Donald Trump was repeatedly described as somehow representative of the working class, and that the people who supported him to the point of invading the Capitol in January are working class simply because they are mostly white and mostly male. Although what we actually found out when people dug into the people who had been there, at least the people who were arrested for being there, they were middle class. They were one person who flew there on her private jet. The people who, and a lot of them were cops related to the policing bill protests that are happening, I believe, as we speak. So I imagine, we'll get into a lot more of this in the questions, but I did want to talk a little bit about the response to this, which is, at least, to some degree, some of the good news in a depressing story. And that is that the US, at least, has seen a wave of unionization among journalists over the last few years that has been really impressive, even if, as I noted at the top, a lot of companies are not exactly bargaining in good faith with their unions. Still, workers at over 20 media outlets have joined either the Writers Guild of America East or the News Guild CWA since 2015. And the last time I ran those numbers was a couple years ago. So I'm sure it may be closer to 30 by now. That, of course, not only affects hiring practices because the unions are bargaining for higher base rates of pay at places like The New Yorker in order to make it more accessible to live in New York City. And that makes it more accessible to people who don't come from money, who maybe, if they did go to university, have a ridiculous amount of student debt. I just paid mine off last year after 20 years. Diversity. Hi, did I somehow get muted? Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know when you lost me, so this is the weird thing about talking on Zoom.
We just missed you for a second.
All right. So unions are bargaining for diversity provisions that will ensure that hiring brings in a broader range of voices, that is journalists of color, but importantly, as Sarah O'Connell was saying, people not from elite backgrounds. And that has affected what is covered once again. So when you have stories about so-called right-to-work laws, which are one of the many anti-union provisions that are in American labor law, it makes a difference that now there are a whole lot of reporters in the US media who have been through a fight about having those provisions inserted into their contracts. It means that we actually see more conversations about class, even in publications like the dearly departed Gawker and Deadspin, the sort of, hipster online media is talking about class war. There's been so much interest in covering things like the union campaign that's going on right now at an Amazon facility in Bessemer, Alabama. Again, one of these places that most certainly has seen a massive loss in local media, that, I'm tripping over stories at this point. I didn't go to Alabama, even though this is my beat, because I figured, well, there's enough people there already and it's a pandemic. So this is changing what the conversation looks like in a lot of US media, even in the mainstream, even in publications that one would not expect to be doing this kind of hard news reporting. When I started work as a full-time journalist, yes, after a graduate degree in journalism, which I got after 10 years working in the service industry because I did not have the money to do unpaid internships when I was in university, there were 3 of us that were trying to cover labor full time. Now there are dozens. There are actual staff reporters who are on the labor beat at a bunch of publications that was not true of 10 years ago. And that said, the crisis of jobs is going to continue. We don't have a functional funding model for journalism, particularly in the US. In the UK, at least, you have the BBC, although that is also broken. So what does that actually mean for covering most? I mean, in this case, I'm talking about most of a very, very large country is being covered from one very, very expensive city. And I do think that unionizing your workplace, your media workplace, is an important part of the solution, but we really actually have to talk about funding models that bring local journalism back into parts of the country that do not have lots of money in prestigious cities and attract, billionaires who decide to start a media project for funsies. So the struggle for a better class representation in the media is actually at its core still a struggle about funding good jobs in the media. And I will leave it there.
Thank you so much. A huge thank you to all our speakers. We have a number of wonderful questions. So I'm going to raise them one by one. And if you could keep your answer as briefly as possible, we can go through many of them. One of the questions is, does social media help or hinder the working class in the media? It seems to reward opinion over journalism. Is that useful for working class?
Will I go?
Yes, please, Sarah, yes.
So in what I do, in the area of news I work in, social media has become a massive thing, and now we employ digital producers just specifically to cut clips for use on social media. I actually think it kind of hinders class representation. I think journalists in mainstream media, and I'm guilty of this myself in many ways, become almost obsessed with Twitter or other Instagram, Facebook, whatever, but Twitter primarily. Most of the young working class kids that I meet, and I meet a lot of young working class kids, I go out of my way to speak to them, they're not on Twitter. They really don't, like if you're poor and you don't have a lot of money, you don't even have a phone that's got a contract. You work on credit. You don't have a smartphone. I personally don't think social media has particularly helped. And I think that mainstream journalists kind of fall into a trap of thinking they're reaching a wider audience by using it. But I actually think they're reaching the same audience that they already were.
Yeah, I think a lot of the obsession with social media is bad. I think the drive to opinion coverage over reporting, however, is not caused by social media. It's caused by people not wanting to pay for reporting. And so it's a lot easier to pay somebody $200 to write an article on the internet that is about their opinion than it is to send somebody to Alabama to report on a union drive. This is you know, there are economic motives at the root of this, not just, you know, it's much easier to get, as Sarah was saying, have a reporter cut news clips from Twitter and pull tweets down to respond to than actually sending somebody out to do real reporting, to do that talking to people in working class communities that Sarah was just talking about.
But can I come in on that? I just like that. I think that in some ways, actually, social media, and I get what you're saying about Twitter, Sarah, but I do know that in some ways it's there. Not, I mean, there are lots of journalists who use it, but I think there's also ways in which working class people or people who are interested in working class politics actually organise themselves on Twitter. And I have met people on Twitter. I mean, people say, oh, it's an echo chamber. And I think sometimes we definitely need an echo chamber. We need to know that there are other people out there that are thinking in the same way that we are. And I think Twitter's very good for that. And I've noticed that there's a lot of support on Twitter. There's also kind of blogs written by working class people who wouldn't necessarily have a kind of outlet for their work. And they, you know, I think a lot of it depends on who you follow and the reasons why you're on there. And I found that social media is kind of useful for making connections with people, to talking to people, to kind of, you know, and I do think, you know, there are things that happen and with mobile phones and people upload stuff. And I do think it's a way of exposing things that, you know, obviously to a limited amount of people, but exposing things that might not necessarily be be exposed by the mainstream media. So I kind of have, you know, a kind of contradictory approach to it, or kind of think about it in a contradictory way. On the one hand, I do agree with you, you know, that it can be problematic, but on the other hand, I think it is a way of kind of connecting with people. And I think that's, you know, I know that there's some kind of, you know, political education projects going on at the moment, and most of that has come from Twitter, and people are finding out about it through Twitter, and they can share it through Twitter, and then they can upload it. And I think that's really important, because we're talking about, you know, the fact that working class people don't have these outlets, that they don't have these platforms. So I think in some ways social media does provide a platform.
Can I just say, I don't disagree with what you're saying about working class people getting on blogs and having reach and platforms that they didn't have before. But, and it's a big but to me, journalists get paid. You know, when I work for mainstream, I get paid for what I'm doing. And you know, that's not the answer really, is it? That a working class person, I hear you, that they get an audience and they get a platform, but I want them to get paid.
I do think that, you know, a lot of working class kind of education and political movement was about a kind of collective approach, because they weren't going to get paid and no one's going to, so you have to do it, otherwise it's not going to get done. And I absolutely agree with you. Yeah. But you know, it's not happening. We're not getting into the media. We're not getting into academia. You know, so I think in that sense, I think it's a really good thing that people can get their thoughts and challenge the dominant media kind of representations of working class people.
Yeah.
Thank you. If we can move on, because there are lots of questions to go through, and exactly related to these issues in terms of the pay and people actually who are paid employment. And this particular question is a sore subject for many people, in particular union activists. The question is, what has happened to industrial relations reporting? Is it just lack of funds, or was there a conscious decision to stop reporting on trade unions issue? I know Sarah Jaffe has already alluded to some of the recent development and incidents which have happened, but if we could specifically focus on this question, that would be fantastic. Dee, perhaps you can start.
I'm probably not one person to talk about this. I mean, I'm not a journalist, so I don't really, I mean, Sarah's probably better to kind of talk about this one than me.
Well, I think industrial relations reporting has probably gone the same way as another really valuable area of reporting that we don't see anymore, which is court reporting. You know, I think it takes a lot of time to get you sort of head around industrial cases, and this, you know, with court reporting as well, this sort of journalism, it's quite skilled, it costs money, and you're not guaranteed results. You might sit through a court case or an industrial case for weeks and nothing happens, and what are you left with? So I would guess that it's money. The issue is money. That, same way with investigations, which sort of industrial reporting, court reporting, you're in that sort of orbit where editors just don't want to spend money. And to be fair to editors, some of my editors would love to spend money on it, but they're not given money to spend on it. So I think it'll be about money, but I feel equally strongly about court reporting. I go into courts now and there's no journalists in these courts, which, this stuff needs to be watched. People need to be holding others to account, and we're not doing that. And same goes with industrial reporting. So I personally think it will be money. It will be money underpinning it.
Yes, to all of that. It is very much money, and it's reporting, and it's not a beat that people respect. I had to fight even at left-leaning publications for quite a long time to convince people that the stories I wanted to do were stories. Now I've written 2 books and, that have been well reviewed and all of this, and I'm still struggling a lot of the time to convince editors that these stories matter. So there is definitely a huge part of it that's just money, that they're we're not going to send you to go chase this story that you say is a story. I do have better luck with it than I did 10 years ago. So some of that is my own personal, I have enough name recognition that people know who I am now, but also there has been, some change in it. And at least in the US, it's also gone along with the fortunes of the labor movement. So as union density goes down, as there are fewer big strikes and actions happening, there is less interest in covering it. And of course, when there are things happening in workplaces, when there are actions, when there are strikes, when there are big firings that are messy, when unions are active, then it's a bit easier to sell stories as a freelancer. But of course, some of this is that the people who are in the editing positions, again, often don't have any relationship with unions. And so one of the things that's been changing that is, like I was saying, that unionization of these newsrooms leads editors to go oh, I get why that's a story now.
I mean, the only other thing I would say is I can't imagine the levels of your frustration, Sarah, because industrial reporting and labour reporting, from what I see in the UK's newsrooms, I mean, we've all seen these stories on the so-called gig economy, which, never mind your frustration, it drives me mad. No sort of drilling down into what that actually means, which is basically a complete lack of workers' rights, exploitation of the workforce, all the rest of it. We've really not seen that, and mainstream news instead, will do a 1 week story, and left-leaning newspapers are as guilty. The Guardian's done this on this big expose on something like Amazon. All the young people I meet from poorer backgrounds, working class backgrounds, they're working for agencies. Everyone I meet is working for an agency, but we have nobody takes it seriously, which again feeds back into the lack of class diversity in the newsrooms, because if you're from a wealthy background, your child is not running around loading boxes for £7 an hour. I mean, it just goes round and round, but I cannot imagine the levels of your frustration, only to be mirrored by mine, I hasten to add. But
that's a very interesting point, because a number of questions that we have received precisely are trying to engage with that particular concern, the lack of working class journalists, the lack of diversity in the newsroom. One of the questions asked, what are the exact barriers? Is it just a matter of ownerships and the fact that the media owners are not interested in representing working class? And one particular question very precisely asked, should there be a diversity quota to ensure mainstream newsrooms are hiring journalists from working class background?
Who wants to go? Because I feel like I'm talking endlessly. I'll be really quick. It's about money. Lack of class representation in the newsrooms, I think. one of the ways to get a staff job at the BBC or anywhere else in mainstream news for that matter is to freelance, is to pitch stories and get a bit of work that way. If you've got wealthy parents and they're paying for your rent and everything's cozy and you can afford to work 2 months a year for 3 years to get a few, like big news orgs to say you work, fabulous, everything's fine. You will eventually get offered a staff job. If you're any good, that is. If you can't do that, then you can't exist. You have to eat. And anyone who does any freelance journalism knows that it can take us weeks and weeks and weeks before we can get anything near transmission in broadcast or print. So it's about money and also about class. And secondly, regards diversity quotas in the newsroom, yeah, I absolutely agree with this as an idea. The problem is with class is it's not as easily identifiable as race. And, I can just see the endless arguments about how one is defining the working classes. But as an idea and, as a matter of principle for me, I have no problem with that because something has to change, doesn't it? So we have to find a way of doing it. If it doesn't work, we'll find another way.
Well, like I kind of said at the end of my talk, I think, we need to start putting pressure on the government to implement the social and economic duty of the Equality Act. And I think, so if you come from a manual working class background, I think one of the ways in which it's kind of recognized that you're working class is if you have, the educational achievement of your parents and the kind of jobs that they did. But if you come from what's euphemistically called an underprivileged background, then it's up to the local authorities and the institutions to make allowances for that in exactly the same way as they, make allowances for other kind of quotas. And I think it's really important that we start to pressure our MPs to implement that part of the Equalities Act. Because like I say, we can talk about race and gender and sexuality and pregnancy, but all of those things are affected by our class position. So until we have that, and the reason it's so difficult is because we live in a class society where and the thing about living in a class society is we can celebrate differences of race and gender and say, oh, it's great. We've got X amount of kind of ethnic minorities. We've got X amount of women, and we can celebrate that. But who the hell is going to celebrate class difference? We're not going to go, oh, it's great. We've got lots of poor people working for us. So I think, we need to kind of really think about that as a start, implementing the social economic duty, which is there. It's there on the statute books. It's just no government has implemented yet. It's been there since 2010, I think. So, it's part of the Equalities Act, but working class people aren't considered equal. Obviously, we live in a really unequal society.
So also the problem with quotas is that class is complicated. Class is not something you can see on somebody, as people have already noted, but also, so my family, when I was little, my parents owned a small business. We had a bunch of money. I went to private elementary school, and then my dad's businesses crashed and burned, and we were supported for several years by my mother, who was a domestic worker. So she was going in and cleaning people's houses for a living. So what does that make me on a class quota list? It certainly made me a labor journalist, right? The experience of downward mobility is certainly why I am who I am today. But the thing that I also want to talk about is it's beyond quotas, because what quotas give us in the US is there's a handful of reporters of color that get moved from job to job because those are the 5 Black reporters that everybody knows. And there is, meanwhile, no pipeline to get young Black people from the working classes into the media. So if you're one of the people who's managed to claw your way in somehow, then people are like, oh, well, we know that person. And we're not creating pipelines to actually bring people in. Instead, the pipelines are Ivy League university to unpaid internship, to another unpaid internship, to eventually maybe a staff job, or more likely you're a freelancer. And, I'm able to be a freelancer because I'm supported by a fellowship that essentially underwrites the fact that the media doesn't pay me enough to live on. So things like that, it's wonderful for me. It allows me to do the work that I think is important, but it's not a solution to actually making journalism a sustainable career. And that, you know, all of these questions, from unpaid internships to how do we bring people in from a variety of class and educational backgrounds, how do we set up qualifications for these jobs, how do we work with people when they start? I've had editors who yelled at me to bring in more diverse writers, so I did. And then they wanted to cut their pieces because they weren't up to snuff on the first round of edits. And I'm like, well, that's why we have to work with people. Because of course, yeah, if you went to Harvard, your writing is going to be more polished than somebody who maybe didn't go to college. However, that doesn't mean that the person who didn't go to college can't learn, because these are skills, they are learned. So, I mean, the whole system is structured against people getting in from anything other than elite universities and rich parents.
Thank you. One of the actually early questions, I'm really sorry, I apologize to the person who asked these questions, and actually maybe we could have and should have started with this particular question, and that is to do with the question of definition. The question is as such: I have an MA and have been told that I am middle class, even though I'm working class. Should there be a clear definitions shared by the media on what would categorize as an individual as a working class? How would you define it?
Shall I go? Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting I mean, it's a really interesting one. It's one that I've come across myself on numerous occasions. Because I now have a PhD, people say to me, oh, but you're not working class anymore. And I have a massive problem with that. I mean, I was brought, like Sarah, I was brought up on a council estate. You know, I was a single parent. I was a cleaner. I didn't go to university till I was 35. My trajectory is very, very different from the trajectory of a middle class person. And it's been very, very, very difficult for me to get to where I am now. And even now within academia, I come across classism. You know, I've been told I'm too loud. I mean, you know, it doesn't stop. So the idea that because you get an education, somehow that means you can roll it back to year zero, and all those experiences of growing up poor and in poverty and watching your parents kind of, you know, work 2 jobs just so they can put food on the table, and dying young because, you know, smoking and drinking and all of those things. So I have a real problem with that idea. You know, why can't you be a working class person with an MA? What, working class people can't have MA? Why can't I be a working class person with a PhD? You know, why do I stop being working? You know, if I was from Italy, I would still be an Italian person with a PhD. And if I moved I would still be an English. So what is it about that is it about snobbery that I can't be working class? And I think the most important thing is that, you know, for middle class people from privileged backgrounds, it's very easy. It tends to be kind of school, you know, parents who are incredibly supportive, a room of their own, lots of books, holidays abroad, lots of cultural capital, you know, nice schools, university, and then, yeah, the unpaid internship. That is not true for working class people who get an education. It is a very, very different trajectory, a very different journey, and it kind of goes down all kinds of strange ways and dead ends. So I think, you know, we really have to fight that idea that because you have an education, I mean, you might have an education and your life will not be economically determined anymore, and that's something different. But, you know, the idea that all of a sudden you stop being working class, I find a very strange one. And I think, I don't know if people agree with me, but I think there's an element of snobbery in this. You know, how can you be, you know, from a council estate in Peckham and have a PhD? That isn't, you know, that doesn't happen. So, yeah, I mean, it's why it's something I feel really, really strongly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sandra.
Me? I suppose I should say, sorry, I should say that I wasn't brought up on a council estate, just in case all my friends at school, in case all my friends at school going, you're not from a council estate, what are you talking about? Sorry, I wasn't class. I mean, like, it's impossible to define class, isn't it? And I do think a lot of this, I mean, like I said before, the media, the BBC, sorry, have got on their, or they had on their freelance forms, Did your parents go to university, which I took as a class question. They're trying to identify people's class. It's just a really hard one, isn't it? Because what you're saying, Dee, I agree with you that if you've got a PhD or God knows what else, you can still be working class. However, if you are educated to a certain level, I'm guessing, and I'm not talking about you personally, I'm guessing that you will have networks. There's two things to me that prevent working class people getting into mainstream media: networks or contacts, if you want to call them contacts, and money. So you can still be working class and educated and living in a nice house and earning a nice income and still be working class. But the people I think we're all talking about here in a way is those people that, by definition of their backgrounds, are being excluded. And, I can see someone in mainstream media finding it much more palatable to take someone from a working class background who has a PhD from Oxford. There's kids that have got this kind of they'll find that much easier and more palatable, and you're likely to get in much faster, which is, I don't have a problem with that, but it wouldn't be helping the kids that, I meet kids on the estates that I see have real flair with camera. They'll take my camera off me and ask to film, and they've got real talent, but have literally no idea. They'll ask me, like, almost goggle-eyed, how did you get this job? Where did you get this job from? Those are the kids that I'm just like, there has to be a way to connect those children and those young people with what I do.
Is it all right if I come back, the other Sarah? I do agree with you, and I think it's one of the reasons why. I don't think that you have those networks, Sarah, if you are an educated working class person, because you don't have the cultural capital. You don't have the background that gives you the confidence, that gives you the networks. You just don't have them because you don't come from that background. If you're, there are times when I'm in a room and I'm the only person that was brought up on a council estate. I'm the only person that's never been skiing. I'm the only person that wasn't privately educated. And so I stick out like a sore thumb. So I don't have those networks. And, I think the research has shown that if you're from a working class background in all the professions, you're less likely to earn as much or be as promoted as much because you don't have those networks. But I think
I've got one more question which I want to press before, and I'm going to abuse my position as a chair, and if possible, add a few more minutes to the session. Sarah, Jaffe, would you like to come back on this question, and then I can move on to the final question?
Just ask the next one, and I'll wrap them up together.
Okay. As a final question, hopefully we can wrap it up in few minutes. Those of you who watched the opening keynote speech by Jeremy Corbyn to the Media Democracy Festival will remember pretty well that he started by referring to the situation, to an amazing a farmers' strike in India. He referred to the situation in Turkey, Paraguay, and really presented a significantly internationalist perspectives on the development. And I think on the question of class, which always has been based around notion of the international solidarity, I thought it would be interested really to kind of in a way focus on much bigger developments rather than just particular incidents here or there. A few years ago, International Labour Organization reported that 1.5 billion workers, that is more than 50% of the global workforce, were in a precarious employment globally. The picture has become even bleaker post-pandemic. According to the report, which was published in the latter part of 2020 by the same organization, Independent Labour Organization, 80% of a global workforce of 3.3 billion is affected by full or partial workplace closure. To what extent do you think the media have really grasped the horror of this reality of workers, not just in the United States, not just in the UK, but what's happening in India, what's happening in Bangladesh, Pakistan, China, Latin America, and the rest of the globe? That's the final question, and hopefully we can wrap it up. And anybody who would like to
really quick on this, I can say they haven't grasped it at all. And if you know, like if you're in an ivory tower, which most of my colleagues are, I'm not going to lie about it, and like definitely most of my bosses, not all of my colleagues, you're not even grasping what's going on in the estate across the road from you. You know, that you walk down that street every day. You don't have a clue, like I was saying before, about agency work. That, you know, instead you refer to it as the gig economy and make it sound a bit fluffy, and it's all, which is just rubbish, isn't it? We all know that. So as far as hoping that UK national news media is worrying about what's happening to people in India or Venezuela or anywhere else for that matter, like, no, it's not even touching the sides. I mean, I can't speak for foreign news because I'm not in foreign news, but as far as I'm concerned, like just amongst my colleagues, editors, not really.
I mean, I think, yeah, the kind of reporting of kind of international news is very selective in the mainstream media, and anything that challenges the kind of neoliberal perspective is obviously, I mean, it's often misrepresented. I mean, we lived in Venezuela for a year when Chavez was alive, and we would be sitting in Caracas reading the newspaper, reading The Guardian, Rory Carroll lying about what was happening in Venezuela, you know, and there was this real kind of experiment happening, a real kind of shift in the way that things were being done. And, you know, there were kids from the barrios reading Gramsci, reading Marx, you know, kids from the barrios that had not got a proper education were now at university. I mean, it was an amazing time. I mean, obviously there were problems, but you know, the mainstream media here were actually saying things that weren't true about, you know, and it seemed that, you know, Rory Carroll always just spoke to one person who'd lost a child in a gunfight, but he never spoke, and he stayed in the really wealthy part of Caracas. He never went into the barrios. He never went down to the kind of where the ordinary people were trying to make a change. So I think that's a massive problem. But I also think it's really, really important that we do realise that we have an international working class. It's very easy, I think, to lose sight of that here because class is such a big issue in this country. But there is an international working class. And I think maybe one of the good things about social media is it's one of the ways that we can connect with other people, in our, you know, to find out what's going on in a way that our media doesn't tell us what's going on.
Yeah, I started laughing when you asked that question because, like, if we think that like local news is dead, what's happened to international news? We've got, you know, in the US papers are relying on freelancers to cover conflicts where the US is bombing people in Syria, and it's being covered by stringers who get paid $50 a piece. And again, what does that mean for people who are going to go do that? I mean, if it's hard enough to be a freelancer living in the US, if you want to be a freelancer covering wars with no support, if you want to be covering, you know, workers' fights in India, who do you think is paying for that? And I actually wanted to bring something up at the end here that has to do with the last question and has to do with the broader topic that I can't believe I haven't mentioned yet, which is just that, like, most media doesn't expect the working class to be its audience anymore. And that is, again, true of left-wing publications as well. Everything is tailored at who's going to pay for subscriptions, who's going to pay for whatever, who's going to click on the ads, and what do advertisers want? They want well-off readers who are going to buy things. So that has enormously shaped who we think is reading the news. And so, you know, years ago, I wrote something for the Washington Post that I was just like, the way the media is covering the so-called fight for 15, the fast food workers strikes for $15 an hour minimum wage, was just insulting constantly, because the assumption is that the people you're writing about are somehow not the people who are reading the paper, watching the news, whatever it is. And I think this is also a huge problem. If I'm not writing stories about working class people for those same people to read, what the hell am I doing, you know?
Thank you so much. Sadly, our time is up. We, in fact, actually have gone a few minutes over. A huge thanks to all our panelists today. and to all of you for joining us and being part of this really, really important conversation. And may that continue in a different on a different platforms and for such a long time. I would like to finish by saying that the Media Reform Coalition is a voluntary organization that survives mostly on thin air and some kind donors. For these debates that we are having, we would like to acknowledge the support of Byline Time, the Independent Media Associations, the Canary, Bywire News, and Manchester Media. If you would like to support the work of the Media Reform Coalition, then please follow the links on the closing side. Looking forward to seeing all of you in the next panel and next session. Keep safe and good luck.